come on down and chump some of this slop.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Hello and welcome to Cinema Chat. I'm David Heath, and this is the podcast where we talk about the movies and the people that made them. You may have surmised what this podcast is going to be about. We're going to talk about the very first blockbuster in history, or at least that's the way people describe it. In 1975, Jaws came out. Jaws was produced by Richard Zanuck, and it was directed by Steven Spielberg. It stars Roy Scheider as Chief Martin Brody. He's the chief of police, but he's the chief of police in a town that is surrounded by the ocean, but he's afraid to go in the water. Elaine Gary plays his wife, Ellen Brody. Richard Dreyfuss plays an expert on oceanography, and he knows a lot about sharks. Robert Shaw also knows a lot about sharks, but he's a tough guy, and he loves catching sharks. He views sharks as his enemy. Murray Hamilton stars as the mayor that lives in denial about the beach being unsafe. Jaws takes place in Amity. It's a fictional town. It was actually filmed in Martha's Vineyard. It begins with a couple of young adults going out to the water. The girl swims out a little bit, and she gets eaten by the shark. The mayor tells Sheriff Brody that they can't shut down the beach the week of the 4th. And the hope was that this was an isolated incident. Chief Martin Brody is skeptical and doesn't really want to let that beach be open, but the mayor is the mayor. The sheriff ended up monitoring the happenings at the beach. The next day, as a little boy is swimming in the shallow water, he gets eaten by a shark. In a town meeting, it's declared that the beaches will be closed temporarily, and the folks in the meeting were not happy about that. You see, the town of Amity depended on the summer business, the summer revenues, and all the businesses that were around. They didn't get that kind of business in the cold winter. They got it in the summer. So the mayor was really frightened, not so much by the shark, but selfishly he needed to keep revenues up. He needed to keep business owners in the community happy. And while the beach is closed temporarily, there is a reward that's offered to capture the evil shark. Richard Dreyfuss comes in on the film as Matt Hooper. He plays an expert on oceanography. He comes from the Oceanographic Institute. Matt Hooper and Chief Brody try to figure out the psychology or science of what's going on with this shark. They just want to stop it. Some fishermen actually go out and catch a huge tiger shark, and they want to claim their reward. Matt Hooper tells Chief Brody, though, that they need to cut the shark open and see if it's actually the perpetrator. It indeed was not the right shark. We wouldn't have a movie if it was. But the mayor says that they're going to open up the beaches anyway and take that chance. He's hoping it was the shark. I think the mayor knew it wasn't, but cautious swimmers go out to the water again, and guess who shows up to the party? A shark is spotted, and there's an absolute panic, of course. It only turned out to be a hoax. it was two dumb kids swimming with a fake shark fin. Hopefully they got in trouble. Unfortunately, the terrifying great white is spotted minutes later and creates another victim. And he got close to Chief Brody's son, nonetheless. Enter Quint. Quint is played by Robert Shaw, and he is the expert shark hunter. He is a know-it-all and very cocky. Kind of rude and a little brooding. Chief Brody and Hooper hire him and decide to hunt the shark together. They didn't really like him, but they felt like that was their best shot. Trying not to spoil the ending, but we do get to see Brody go on the boat when he's afraid and just absolutely terrified of the water, clearly. We also see Hooper go down in a cage to lure the shark. We see all three of the men at one time or another get in direct combat with the giant shark. And it was all taking place on the Orca. The Orca was Quint's boat, and so since it was his boat, he acted like the boss. Even though we had the sheriff there, and he constantly was demeaning the other two on the boat. Really didn't want him on the boat. But Brody or Hooper, neither one respected or liked Quint, but they were stuck with him, and they felt like Quint at least was a tough guy that could probably get it at the end. Jaws won 3 Academy Awards, including Best Dramatic Score by the great John Williams. Director Steven Spielberg also worked with Williams in Close Encounters of the Third Kind and the Indiana Jones movies, as well as E.T. and Jurassic Park. John Williams has also worked with many other directors, including Frank Sinatra, Arthur Hiller, Don Siegel, Robert Altman, Clint Eastwood, Alfred Hitchcock. He wrote the score for 1978's Superman movie, directed by Richard Donner. John Williams is best known for his work on the Star Wars films. He's 86 years old and still working. John Williams has credited Tchaikovsky and also Richard Wagner as his big influences for his neo-romantic style. He has been nominated for the Academy Awards 49 times. That's pretty unprecedented. Well, you know what I will tell you is that Jaws, the movie, is not the same without the music. So you want to get in the water now? Probably not. So there were some really interesting nuggets about this movie. First of all, Steven Spielberg almost didn't get the job. Dick Richards was actually the first director, and he was in a meeting with the studio executives, and they were talking about some concepts of the film, and he said something to the effect of, well, and then on the end scene, we could have the whale jump out of the water and the studio executives looked at each other and thought, this isn't about a whale. It's about a shark. You understand the difference? And he struggled for a minute there. They fired him, and they hired the young Steven Spielberg, only 27 years old. Filmed Jaws was filmed on the open waters in the Atlantic. This turned out to be, well, we won't call it a mistake, but it was something that was very difficult for them to handle. No movie had ever been shot on the open waters. When you see movies from the past, you see ships. You see a boat on a water, but the people acting in the movie are typically really not on a boat on the water. So it was filmed out where they were at the mercy of the winds and the tides, and other boats got in the way. When they didn't have digital the way they do today, they couldn't just, when a boat was coming by, they couldn't just delete it off the picture. They had to leave it in. So they had to sit there and wait for a boat to move, which would take 7-10 minutes of time. And then Steven Spielberg said that then there'd be 2 more boats that would get in the picture, and it was just crazy. They did have 2 boats named Orca. Remember, Orca is the boat that's Quint's boat, and that's the boat that the 3 men go try to capture the shark. And there were 2 of the orcas on the set, and one of them actually sank with the actors and the film crew on it. Well, the actors and the film crew got off the boat on time, but they actually sat there and watched the boat sink. So luckily they had a backup orca ship. But production time and budget more than doubled. And give you some background, this is Universal Studios. Universal Studios was known for decades and decades and decades of making movies that were on point with their budgets. And if you have a director that goes over, they're not gonna finish it. But fact of the matter is, they sank $4 million into the picture already. And they weren't going to just let that go away. So they ended up threatening to fire Spielberg more than once. I think actually more than several times. They threatened to fire him, threatened to stop the shooting, but ultimately they thought it's probably better to sink a little more money into it and hope that it does become something great. Universal Studios did not do this kind of stuff. And to give you some more background, Universal Studios, if you go back to the early days, they were the ones that did the smaller budget films. They did a lot of the monster movies that the bigger studios like MGM wouldn't even bother with. There's certain companies that, 20th Century Fox did a lot of gangster movies, in the 30s and 40s, and MGM, did the musicals, and then before that they did the big epic pictures like Gone with the Wind and the Wizard of Oz and things like that. But Universal was not into the business of making big budget movies. Well, here they are, being asked over and over again, we got to get more money, we got to get more money, we got to get more money. Otherwise, we can't finish the film. And so the production time was supposed to be around 60 days. It turned out to take 157 days. The budget doubled, more than doubled. It was $4 million, and then it eventually became $9 million when you include the marketing that went into it. Spielberg thought about making it like the old monster movies, with some levity though. Richard Dreyfuss does provide that humor, and there's a lot of sarcasm going on, and he and Quint did not like each other in the movie, and by most accounts they did not like each other in person. So the chemistry, or the bad chemistry that you see that the two have in the film, Actually, it was bad chemistry that they had in person as well. But anyway, the Spielberg wanted to make it like one of those old time movies, and Spielberg had some ideas for casting. He wanted Lee Marvin as Quint, and Lee Marvin, of course, is one of the ultimate tough guys. Would have been perfect for the role, but Lee Marvin said, interestingly enough, he said, I don't have time. I'm going to go on a big fishing trip. That's a little rich. But yeah, Lee Marvin turned down the part so he could go on a fishing trip. Well, Steven Spielberg pegged Dreyfuss from the beginning, though. He wanted Richard Dreyfuss for the part of Hooper, but Dreyfuss turned him down. And finally, after 6, 7, 8 phone calls, Richard Dreyfuss finally gave in and said, okay, I'll do it. Richard Dreyfuss said he didn't want to go out there because he knew it was going to be a disaster on the open waters. He knew that would happen, and it indeed did happen. When you're worried about all the tides and the winds, it becomes a mess. Charlton Heston wanted to play the part of Brody. He called Steven Spielberg and said he wanted to be Brody, and Steven Spielberg admired Charlton Heston, but he said he was just too big of a star, and he thought, well, the shark is the star of this film, and he needed Brody to be somewhat vulnerable as well, which is something that Chuck Heston just wasn't vulnerable very often. The shark was the star. They hired several people to construct the mechanical shark. And it was hard to do because all the models would stop operating underwater. And they would constantly hear, according to Richard Dreyfuss, the shark broke down in some way or another every single day on the set. And then they would always hear the big call on the bullhorn, "The shark is not working. The shark is not working." So they had to improvise with the mechanical shark breaking down every day. So Spielberg came up with the brilliant idea of maybe turning it into more like a Hitchcock movie with the shark, with the actual visual part of the shark playing a lesser role and not being seen quite as much. And in the beginning, this worked really well because Chrissy, the teenager in the beginning of the film, or a teenager, young adult, is being pulled back and forth with pulleys underwater. The thought is the audience would be terrified by seeing that without the shark. Fear of the unknown. Steven Spielberg has amassed a fortune over $3 billion for making huge movies. He was coming off of the moderately successful Sugarland Express with Goldie Hawn. Before that, a much different project. There's a strong case to be made for Jaws being the most impactful movie of the 70s. It changed the way a lot of studios thought. They thought, well, let's go ahead and release these movies that we make at the same time everywhere and see what happens. Jaws had a $9 million budget, and it brought in $474 million. The film was released and marketed as a summer movie. Producer Richard Zanuck and director Spielberg were very deliberate about marketing the film. Release dates weren't that big of a deal prior to Jaws. It used to be you'd make a movie and then you'd release it while you're waiting. That's what the thought was as a studio. Well, now we've gotten to the point where studios deliberately release movies at certain times because of the type of movie it is. Well, it's a summer movie. Oh, it's a romantic comedy, so we can issue that in February. Well, obviously Christmas movies are in November, but there's certain times where movies come out, and Jaws actually set that precedent. And it was the most it was the most big moneymaker, or the biggest moneymaker up to that time. Star Wars did take that mantle away from Jaws a couple years later. But summer movies were born in 1975 with Jaws. There was a lot of merchandise, such as T-shirts, that helped make that helped make the film become even more profitable. The movie did get some criticism for the PG rating. Many thought the film was far too graphic and terrifying for kids. It no doubt was edited perfectly on a fine line. In fact, Jaws did win an Academy Award for Best Editing. Jaws obviously was a massive hit. It was released at 442 theaters on the same weekend. And that was the most theaters one movie had ever been released at the same time. A sequel was inevitable. Steven Spielberg, though, declined the opportunity to direct Jaws 2. He thought the first one was definitive and stated sequels are cheap carny tricks. Universal Pictures brought Janot Swart to direct the sequel. Roy Scheider and Lorraine Geary, Marie Hamilton all reprised their roles in Jaws 2. Jaws 2 was mostly shot on the Emerald Coast in and near Fort Walton Beach, Florida. It still takes place in the make-believe town of Amity, and there was still some shoots in Martha's Vineyard, but the water shots were all in Fort Walton Beach and nearby Navarre Beach. Once again, the film's budget was bloated, and shooting took a lot longer than hoped. $30 million budget, $178 million revenues. So the budget tripled, but the revenues were cut in half. The reviews were somewhat mixed. Jaws 3 came out in 1983. It was shot in 3D. And it was actually known as Jaws 3D. Matter of fact, I remember telling my mom I want to go see Jaws 3D. Mostly filmed in SeaWorld Orlando. The budget was down to $18 million and brought in only $30 million. It had negative reviews, and Dennis Quaid was the lead in the film. The lead person in the film. Jaws the Revenge was a third sequel. It was released in 1987. The movie made a profit, but actually is one of the few films ever that has a 0% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, meaning absolutely zero critics favorably reviewed this movie, and that's pretty bad. The inferior sequels can't take away from the beauty or awe from the one we got in 1975, the first one. Jaws was a movie that Steven Spielberg said gave him the ability to make any film he wanted to afterward. And as we know, he did make some movies that were going to be difficult to make if any other director wanted to do it later. Saving Private Ryan, Schindler's List, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Those are all movies that would have been big risk takers. And they decided, since it was Spielberg, they'll go with it. And usually Spielberg brings home the money. But in any case, it's been really fun talking about Jaws. This is a movie that came out when I was a little boy. I did see it on TV, and yes, I was scared, but yes, I was intrigued, and yes, I was entertained. And I think that's what they were going for. And anyway, it's been great talking about it, and I think I'm looking forward to talking about more movies with all of you fun people. And hopefully I will have more and more people listening to and commenting on and talking about the podcast. And hopefully the website will be up soon. In any case, this is Cinema Chat. I am David Heath. And this is the podcast where we talk about the movies and the people that made them. Thanks a lot for joining me.